Evening, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to round 9 of the AROC Racing League's Touring Car Championship for 2025. I can't believe we're already at round 9, heading into the final few races of the season. Now, well over 2/3 of the way through the running for this season as we look onwards to the rest of the AROC Racing League's action for 2025. But first, we've got to bring an end to our current championships. And here we are in qualifying here in Miami for this evening's racing. Just under 4 minutes ago until the end of the session. This session currently being led, as it has been pretty much from start to finish, by David Taylor. Comfortable margin as well. A 2-minute 2.276. That's ahead of Alan Matthews. 2-minute 4.819. Just ahead, actually, of Paul Millman there. 2-minute 6.9. And then we have Matt Daly, who's only posted a bit of an outlap at the moment. But Paul Millman currently losing out to Steve Knight, who's actually had to retire from the session. I think he might be having a couple of technical issues from what I could see in the paddock chat earlier. But had a 2-minute 6.1. So a bit of a battle going on potentially between Steve Knight and Paul Millman at some point in this weekend if we are able to get Steve back. But Matt Daly currently on a 2-minute 9 flat. I suspect that we're going to see immense improvement from that, though, as we get a more representative time as he heads through the first sector here at Miami and runs down in towards the end of the middle now, actually. Sector 1, a personal best, of course, for Matt Daly there. As we come towards the end of the, I'm going to call it stadium section. It kind of drapes around the stadium, does the Miami International Autodrome. It's an interesting track, shall we say, although I have to say I was impressed by the racing on the Sunday's Grand Prix, in the sense that there was actually some, which isn't always a given. So thank you, Lando Norris, for that one. Some bold overtaking moves. And for a couple of drivers in the field, actually, as well. I thought Alex Albon had a great run out. Yeah, Lando Norris versus Max Verstappen. And it certainly went better than it did in Austria last year. But yeah, some interesting battles between McLaren and the Red Bulls. So let's see if we're going to have the same thing here this evening in the AROC Racing Leagues as Matt Daly jumps onto the brakes to head around the tight left-handed hairpin. This is certainly a sector of the lap as we come towards the end of the lap now. What caught me out a few times in my previous running around this circuit. It is a personal best through sector 2. Can Matt Daly make it a hat trick? He does not, in fact, but he does still leapfrog ahead of both Paul Millman, Steve Knight, and Matt Daly. Sorry, no, Alan Matthews, rather. Matt Daly goes second in this session. A 2-minute 4.2. That is behind David Taylor. I was actually chatting to Greg Young at Spring Alfa Day a couple of weeks ago now, where we were we were both in awe pretty much of David Jelly's pace, really, especially Greg, who is certainly a skilled driver in and of himself, who just really didn't seem to know how on earth he was so quick. I liken David to a bit of an alien out on track. He's just so robotic. He's so quick out there. I do think the racecraft not 100% there just yet, but he is, of course, a young driver. But a remarkable start to this race weekend for David Jelly there with a comfortable lead in this session. That is provisional pole with a 2-minute 2.2, 2 seconds ahead of Matt Daly, his nearest rival. And speaking of rivalries, let's have a look at the championship as we head into this race weekend. It is currently being led by Matt Daly, 398 points to David Jelly's 343, so just over 50 points separate these two drivers. Of course, 50 points being the maximum that one can take away from a race weekend. So as we head into the final few rounds, the fight is still very much on between these two drivers, folks. And David Jelly is doing his utmost to try and close down that gap. Matt Daly running in P2 in this session, but still leads the championship. And then there's a huge gap down to the likes of Alan Matthews, Andrew Whitehead, Andy Graker, Will Inglis, with Alan Matthews 154 points, just ahead of Andrew Whitehead, 152. And then we have Graker with 107, Will Inglis 101. So it's looking very close indeed for the rest of our pack as well, although they are pretty spread out overall. David Jelly and Matt Daly really having control of this championship, so to speak. We do have the return of Steve Knight, which is great news for this evening's running, but the clock is about to hit 0 seconds, which means that these will be the driver's final few attempts now as Matt Daly heads back onto the start-finish straight. Is it an improvement on this lap so far? It is not, and a 2-minute 4.2 is all he can manage, although I suspect he is actually going to get another go around here of the Miami International Autodrome, so that is great news for Matt Daly. Alan Matthews, meanwhile, is also out on track as he heads into that final sector now. The long back straight here, where you're really going to exercise all 300 and something horsepower of this car. 2-minute 4.2 to beat for Alan Matthews. There's only 1,000th of a second separating Alan Matthews and Matt Daly as Alan Matthews improves on another previous attempt there. Can he usurp Matt Daly? It'll be very crucial for his race weekend if he can do that. You want to be heading into the first corner here at Miami with an advantage. Just look at the battle between Verstappen and Piastri on Sunday as Alan Matthews now heads back onto that start-finish straight. No improvements to be found so far on the lap for Alan Matthews, and no improvements overall. That is all Alan Matthews can manage in this session. Matt Daly is safe in P2, but can he try and push a bit closer to P1? Let's see as we stomp on the brakes for the upcoming left-hander. Quite a few circuits at this. So quite a few circuits at this corner. Fight you corner. I'll try. No. Yeah. Brain. Fight. Yeah. Rebooting Reeve. Either way, quite a few corners at this circuit. There we go. Professionalism eventually pulls through. As there we see a bit of a cone. Well, that would be a cone penalty in the world of karting. It's not going to be here in the world of touring car action, but that is very reminiscent of Max Verstappen's struggles in 2024, actually. He had a cone at exactly the same point on the circuit. And of course, that was a big telltale sign that the Red Bull was starting to lose its comfortable advantage that it enjoyed for so long in this ground effect era of Formula One. Matt Daly a little bit less affected by it as we head down towards the end of the back straight. The brake disc glowing red hot as you get the car slowed down from the fastest point of the circuit. And just one corner to negotiate now, but you are going to be on throttle for that long sweeping right-hander before you get back to the start-finish straight. There's no improvement so far for Matt Daly. What can he do as he comes across the line? He does not improve. Perhaps not surprising at all. It is going to be David Jelly who takes pole in this session. We'll join you in just a few moments as we get ready for race one here at Miami. Well, here we are on the grid, ladies and gentlemen, ready for race one here at Miami. Just over 30 seconds, and here is our starting order. It will be David Chelly with that remarkable 2-second advantage in qualifying on pole, alongside Matt Daly there. Then we have Alan Matthews, Steve Knight, and Paul Millman, our 5-car grid for the racing action this evening. That all-important run down to turn one, and just in front of us, hello, race director. Well, here we go. A little bit longer than perhaps what used to in a Formula 1 car. A few more seconds to think about the moves, but still the launch very crucial here in these front-wheel drive Giulietta WTCRs. Anyway, we are in fact going to have 6 red lights on the gantry, and we are away ready for race one here at Miami. It is a good start for Matt Daly, who makes an ever so slight advantage on David Chelly as we get away and head down towards turn one. But David Chelly will have the inside, and there's big contact between Alan Matthews and Matt Daly there. Disaster for Matt Daly, bit of a passenger in all of that. I think Alan Matthews was trying to make sure that he was going to try and gain advantage on Matt Daly, but there just wasn't quite a car's width there as he headed to the inside of the corner. David Chelly now leading with a fairly comfortable margin, and Paul Millman, having struggles in qualifying, now finds himself running in P2. I believe Alan Matthews has had further difficulties here at the start of the race. He has indeed. He is going to be able to restart if he so chooses, but he's tumbled down all the way to 5th position. Either way, we go on board with Matt Daly, who finds a way past Paul Millman, so he is pretty much unaffected, really, by those early race incidents, and he's already back up into 2nd position. This is great stuff from Matt Daly. Paul Millman, meanwhile, running in P3, putting that pressure on Matt Daly as we head down towards the end of Sector 2 in just a moment, having a look around the long sweeping left-hander on one of another effective back straight here at Miami. You've, of course, got to navigate your way around the huge stadium here at Miami. And Matt Daly is strong on the defence there, just defends it nicely actually from the outside, and make sure that Paul Millman not able to find a way past. Bit of a gap down to Steve Knight currently running in P4, and then Alan Matthews is just leaving the pits now. I suspect going to treat this race as a bit of a practice run for the reverse grid race coming up next. We go back on board, though, with Matt Daly, who's keeping Paul Millman at bay and trying his best to close up with this man here, David Chelly, who leads the race rather comfortably now, 3.3 seconds. He led qualifying by 2. He leads the race by 3, and we're not even on to the second lap of this race just yet. A remarkable start to proceedings for David Chelly. Here we go then, heading around the final couple of corners to start the next lap of this race. And this is really going to be the battle to watch, folks. It looks like Paul Millman has a bit of a skirmish with the wall. He is able to continue on, though, with only a brief tap there. This is going to be the battle to watch, though, folks. It's going to be between David Chelly and Matt Daly. Of course, not a true representative racing lap we've had yet, but David Chelly is controlling this race rather nicely. And Matt Daly has a bit of a time deficit with that early race incident, but we should see him settle into a bit of a rhythm now. First full racing lap coming up, folks, so we're going to be able to draw some comparisons between our 2 front-running drivers here as Matt Daly does his best to close up to David Chelly to make sure that David cannot shrink the margin that he has in the championship for the final few rounds of this season. Here we go. Our race leader, David Chelly, extending that gap then as we head further into this race. First few minutes, first few laps under our belts now, and that gap now stands at 5.5 seconds, 5.3 seconds at this point. Now, that's a fairly large gap this early on, but we do not know if it's going to be completely insurmountable yet. We never know late on into the race. Matt Daly might have something up his sleeve, all running on the soft compounder tyre in this one, so equal playing field in terms of strategy, in terms of mechanical grip on offer, well, peak mechanical grip on offer to these cars. But David Chelly currently extending that gap out in front with purple sector after purple sector. And yeah, 5.5 seconds, you can be comfortable with that, but you can't completely rest on your laurels. This is a fairly unforgiving circuit, if that is one perk of the layout of the Miami International Autodrome, is that there are quite a number of sections of this lap where there are very little runoffs. It's very reminiscent of Singapore in that sense, I suppose, where it will punish you for making a small error. Just ask quite a few drivers from the Formula One running on Sunday, or on last Sunday. This track will bite if necessary, really. And David Chelly, if he puts 1 foot wrong, could find himself stopped, and you only have to be stopped for about 4 or 5 seconds, and all of a sudden you're going to see Matt Daly right in your rear view mirror there. So certainly has plenty to do still, does David Chelly. Another few purple sectors, though, sees him set a 2-minute 2.252. That is equaling his qualifying pace already in this race. And we have 18 minutes to go. We're going to expect the cars to get a bit slower as the tyres start to wear off a bit, but as the fuel load also gets lighter and the tyres will have some life left in them, there will be a point later on in the race after the track has rubbered up as well, where we are going to see some impressive pace on offer for these cars. On board with David Chelly at the moment. That gap now stands at 7.5 seconds between David and Matt Daly. So David pushing on still and extending that gap. Hasn't quite matched the impressive pace that he demonstrated just a couple of laps ago, but we might see a bit more from him. Looking further back down the order, though, we can see Steve Knight having a good run of things at the moment, currently in P4, and keeping Paul Millman, keeping him company, at least, shall we say, out on a track, separated by just over 2 seconds at the moment. In terms of their pace differential, it is looking rather close. On that last lap, Steve Knight 2 minute 7.3, Paul Millman 2 minute 8.7. So we may see Steve Knight close up here and manage to bring us a bit of a fight between these two purple liveried drivers. So looking forward to seeing that as we head back onto one of the many back straights here at this track. As it turns out, so many wide open throttle opportunities in these rather grippy WTCR cars. They are not quite capable of reaching the dizzying heights of speed as Formula One machinery, which is why when we're at a larger Formula One venue like this, you can pretty much plant the throttle and see where it takes you. As we can see, that gap stands about 2.4, 2.5 seconds based on what mini sector we are in on the lap at the moment. Paul Millman losing out rather substantially, actually, through Sector 1 in comparison to Steve Knight. A really slow Sector 1 for Paul Millman. Steve Knight, not his best either, but still an improvement on the Delta, and closing up is Steve Knight, or at least doing his best efforts to do so, maintaining the gap at the moment at least, and making sure he is there and ready, poised to get the overtake done, if it isn't done on track at least. Once more, that gap still staying pretty consistent. It must be said 2.2 tenths, make that 2.2 tenths, 2.2 seconds, make that 2.2 seconds. Yep, still staying nice and consistent between these two drivers. Paul Millman running in P3, another podium on the cards for Paul, and qualifying to forget really, but making amends for it at the start of this race. But likewise for Steve Knight as well, he wants to be in the mix for this podium, another one to add to his tally this year. He'll be trying to close up there and try and fight for that P3. We're heading down towards the back straight there. Goes a little bit too deep into the corner, a bit too late on the brakes potentially. So does lose some time as a result, but will be able to continue on. Not long to go left on the clock now. Didn't quite get to see that battle, unfortunately, between Paul Millman and Steve Knight. Steve Knight just beginning to back off now, but for most of this race, they were in pretty close quarters overall, so nice to see that. Hopefully we'll get a bit more from them in the reverse grid race coming up just a moment. But David Chelly leading from start to finish, so far at least, on the penultimate lap at the moment. And yeah, has not looked phased at all. I mentioned maybe a couple of worries about overall race craft, but this is a complete demonstration that there is no such fears there for David Chelly. Brilliant pace in qualifying, tremendous pace in the race as well, rather. He leads Matt Daly by 18 seconds now, a mighty margin to be leading this race by, when there were no major incidents out between Matt Daly and David Chelly. Obviously, Matt had that unfortunate start to the race, but didn't lose that much time overall. So 18 seconds with no incidents, that's impressive stuff. Paul Millman defending his spot on the podium at the moment, and Alan Matthews slowly but surely closing into Steve Knight, just unfortunately not quickly enough. 2-minute 5.4 being the best lap for Alan Matthews there, so a good few seconds faster. Just unfortunately, it's not going to be enough for Alan Matthews. We are currently on the penultimate lap of this race. David Chelly is heading down the back straight now. Here we are then on the final lap, and you can just see on this lap in particular, I think the tyres are starting to give up the ghost. The soft tyre then just about perfect to make it through 25 minutes worth of racing here at the Miami International Autodrome. I doubt we'll see any changes for the reverse grid because you can just about nurse them through that 25 minutes. But we saw there David Chelly pushing forward, the front axle just not responding to his inputs, getting substantial understeer. The car's not able to cope with the forces of braking, accelerating and turning, all being done by the front wheels, of course, in these cars. And unfortunately, on worn tyres, they just have not got that life to give. As the tread wears down, they heat more easily. There's less mass physically to the tyre, and it becomes more and more difficult to nurse the tyres home. David Chelly is currently doing that, bounding over the curbs, actually, as he does so. And we head on to the back straight for one last time here in race one. A long wait home then for David Chelly, but what a race it has been. He's, of course, doing his utmost to close up the gap to his nearest rival, Matt Daly. He needs to be putting in performances like this. Matt Daly is here and present this evening, so will be scoring some very good points. He's still running in P2, but he just needs to make sure that he heads into, the last round or the penultimate round with around about 50 or less points. He's currently on 58 points. It's a deficit between the two drivers, but if he can get less than 50, he's going to be with a real shout of taking this championship. He flashes the lights in celebration, weaves as well, and takes the checkered flag. Congratulations, David Chelly. A remarkable race lead there. No major challenges from anyone else. Total control as he brings it home, flashes the lights in celebration. A well-deserved celebration as well. It's a little bit of a wait then to Matt Daly, but still an almighty performance. Let's not forget he started lap one at the very back end of the field, but he crosses the line to take P2 in the end then. Matt Daly bringing it home on the podium and doing his utmost to keep that championship fight alive. It is looking very secure for Matt Daly at this point, it must be said, but mathematically, Chelly is still within a chance. And there we get some victory drifts there from Matt Daly. He's become a bit of an expert at getting this Giulietta drifted, so he'll come home to take P2, continue on that championship fight. We then got a bit more of a wait, to be honest. 40 seconds is the gap between Matt Daly and Paul Millman. These two are heading down the back straight, are Paul Millman and Steve Knight. Into the left-handed hairpin first. It's going to be Paul Millman coming home in P3 on the road. If he can keep it on the road, and it looks like he will, should be no major issues here as we head around the final couple of corners. Round the right-hander then, rounding out the podium, it is going to be Paul Millman, who comes home in P3 after a case of what could have been really in terms of this battle. But well done to Steve Knight for keeping that pressure on for as long as he could, and Steve Knight comes home P4. In the end then, Alan Matthews will come home P5. That's our 5 finishers from race 1. We'll join you in a few moments as we get ready for race 2 here at Miami. sorry there, folks. We had a few issues getting the stream started, but we had a few issues at the start of this race as well. David Chelly, starting from the back, of course, in this reverse grid, now finds himself outside of the circuit. He has to return to the pits for that one. Not an ideal way to start the racing. Matt Daly then currently leading by 1.7 seconds ahead of Alan Matthews, hoping to make amends for his previous race. And there, once again, we're going to have Paul Millman versus Steve Knight now as we head down to the left-hander towards the end of Sector 2. There we see Matt Daly leading rather comfortably now ahead of Alan Matthews, Paul Millman, Steve Knight, and then David Chelly had to return to the pits, unfortunately, and another rollover in this race. It's all the rollovers, and everyone is trying to navigate the way to the outside of the circuit, so it seems. Alan Matthews is going to be able to continue on, but that is disaster for him in this race as well. A race of retribution comes to a very bitter end then for Alan Matthews. Matt Daly, meanwhile, leading. All four wheels still attached to the tarmac. Likewise for Steve Knight, likewise for Paul Millman. Let's not forget, just one race ago, we were wondering if these two were going to have a battle for the podium. Now they are both sat on the podium. This is great stuff for their racing overall. Steve Knight and Paul Millman in P2 and P3. Are we going to see that battle in the end? Then it would be great to see if we can have that. A little bit of damage for everyone in this race so far, I think, as Alan Matthews is able to get underway, as is David Chelly. But really, the race is now a race of three at this point, and Matt Daly leads and will be extending that lead as he posts purple sector after purple sector. Paul Millman, meanwhile, trying to close in on Steve Knight. And we do actually have an interesting development in this race. Paul Millman has jumped onto the medium compound of tyre. He's decided that he's going to sacrifice a bit of early race grip, a bit of early overall mechanical grip, to enjoy some better grip late on into the stint. I did mention that those tyres seem to be giving up at the very end of the race, so Paul Millman's deciding he's going to go for a bit more grip at the end. Let's see how that works out for him then. Currently, the gap between Steve Knight and himself is just over 4 seconds, 4.5 seconds, in fact. He'll be trying to close that up and find a way into P2. But let's have a look at the championship after race 1. Well, I can tell you that it has certainly got a little bit closer between David Chelly and Matt Daly. 416 points to David Chelly's to Matt Daly's name, 383 to David Chelly. So looking better and better still for David Chelly. At least it was up until this race. Something's going to have to go very wrong indeed for Matt Daly in order for him to not expand the gap overall from this race weekend. It has been a disaster of a weekend then, as it turns out, for David Chelly in terms of his championship standings, and just makes it that little bit more difficult for him. Alan Matthews, meanwhile, extends that gap to Andrew Whitehead. Of course, not going to be either race didn't go ideally for Alan Matthews, it turned out. He, of course, has the issue in race 1, and in race 2 finds himself on his roof. So he is able to continue on, but will score some further points to extend that gap from Andrew Whitehead. And I want to have a look at the gap between Paul Millman and Steve Knight. Now, Steve Knight, 71 points to his name. Paul Millman, 83 points to his name. So Paul currently outscoring Steve, but Steve certainly climbing up through the ranks in terms of the points at this point in the championship through his consistency and his attendance. But at the moment, we can see that Steve Knight is also having the measure on Paul Millman in this early phase of the race. I think Paul Millman's probably going to be looking in his rearview mirrors to see how much closer Alan Matthews can get instead of how much closer he can get to Steve Knight. So plenty of development still to be had in this race. Here we go. We can see the pressure mounting on Paul Milburn as we head in further into the lap. And now we are looking down towards the back straight here. Now, in terms of the slipstream effect, it's not overly important in these WTCR cars, but at a long straight like this, as you're getting into the upper echelons in terms of top speed, it is going to make at least a bit of a difference. There is a decent rear wing on these cars. They're not most advanced aerodynamically, as I say, but every little helps, I suppose, as down the inside looks Alan Matthews, and cracking under the pressure there, Paul Milburn stamps on those brakes to try and go as late as possible. That locks up in fact, it looked like both axles locked up there for Paul Milburn, and it just spears him into the wall. That is now P4 for Paul Milburn. He dives into the pits, needs to make some car repairs by the looks of things. That is effectively his race over. Alan Matthews continues on, recovering in this race, then back up into P3. His next target being Steve Knight.